I wasn't always alone, at least since the outbreak. My wife and I survived the initial wave of what, I guess you'd call them zombies. Every day is hell. It's impossible to stay vigilant 24/7. We were getting attacked every time we had set up camp to rest. We got good at making booby traps, and one of us would keep watch in about 3-hour increments, but we'd always wake up the other if more than a handful of zombies showed up. Until that goddamn night. I woke up from what I thought was my worst nightmare into my actual worst nightmare. I barreled through the zombies on top of her, but not even my sawed-off was quick enough. She'd only been scratched a handful of times, but she had a gnarly bite on her calf muscle. We dressed all her wounds and truly believed we'd gotten through the worst of it. Until days later, she started getting weaker. We had some ropes, and she decided it would be best to restrain her while I slept in fear of the worst. My turns to take short naps got less and less, until she told me to kiss her with my mouth closed and my eyes open. Once I did, she blew her brains out with my sawed-off shotgun. I didn't move from that spot for days, except when turning to kill approaching zombies. Just having to look at my wife's motionless body. I couldn't touch her headless corpse. I haven't slept since. You can't sleep when zombie noises are your lullaby. Days later, I started digging a hole where I was standing, and once I had it deep enough, I touched her body for the first time. I placed her in a hole, and I picked up the sawed-off shotgun she used to blow her brains out. I sat there looking at it for minutes, but it felt like hours. I couldn't use that gun anymore, so I threw it next to my wife in the hole and buried them. It took me weeks before I found another shotgun in an old truck in a nearby town. I hadn't seen many zombies since my wife's death. Maybe they were just giving me a break, or maybe they just knew I was pissed. My new life's goal, my only reason for living. Kill as many of those fucking things as I can before I die. I'd grown fond of the idea of dying alone. The world was all shit now anyways. One night while I was surveying a small city, I noticed a teen boy. I followed him for a mile or so outside the city to a cabin that had a little moat around it. I noticed him setting all the traps around his unique campsite. I was only following the boy out of curiosity. I was not going to approach this kid here. He would likely kill me. I waited on the edge of the city searching for supplies, but keeping a close eye on the boy's cabin. I set up a white flag on the edge of the city, hoping he'd see it or come back to town. When it rains, it pours, or so I thought. An old friend I had known from back in college, John Williams, came up to my white flag. What are the odds, not seeing another human for months, and now I've seen 2 in less than 24 hours? One even being from my life long before the outbreak. John and I caught up, talked about the loved one's loss. He mostly asked questions. Something felt off about our whole conversation. He convinced me to take a nap once we had set up camp on a rooftop for the night. How could I have been so trusting so quickly? I woke up struggling to get loose from ropes that he had tied around my wrists and ankles. That teenage boy I earlier had wanted to help was now standing over me talking to John. They robbed me of everything useful I had and left me tied up for dead. I guess life before the outbreak wasn't so different after all. Never trust anybody. At least they left me on top of a building. Tied up anywhere else, they would basically be trying to get me pulled apart by zombies. Days passed, and besides the occasional ant I would eat as they crawled in front of my face, I knew I was most likely to die of dehydration first, but the hunger pains weren't helping. Thankfully, less than a week into my bondage, there was a massive rain that I was able to drink enough rainwater to sustain myself. I was tied up for weeks eating bugs and drinking rain, driving myself insane if anyone could remain sane after not being able to move for weeks. Finally, I heard movement in the stairwell that led up to the rooftop. I started to yell for help, flopping around like a fish. I already felt dead, but I was fighting to survive. The door to the rooftop started to move like someone was pushing on it. Why couldn't they open it, I thought. Fuck was my immediate next thought. As the door busted open, there I laid helpless, looking directly at a zombie. The zombie lunged at me as I tried to roll away like it was possible to escape, but I was doomed. It locked its jaw on my forearm, but I wasn't going down without a fight. I could feel the giant chunk of my forearm getting ripped off by the zombie's bite. It made enough room in my restraints to pull my good arm free. Losing a lot of blood and literally no energy, I mustered all my remaining strength, grabbing the zombie's head and slamming it into the ground again and again and again. Everything went red and I could see my wife blowing her brains out. I came back to reality as I felt the zombie's brains explode through his skull on the concrete. I laid motionless for a moment, contemplating how long I had left before I die or turn into one of those things. I had to fight hard now. I freed my ankle restraints and went down the stairs to a saw I'd remember seeing when John had led me up to that rooftop. I figured I had no chance otherwise. I grabbed the saw and started hacking away at the bicep of the arm the zombie had taken a chunk out of. It took a few minutes to fully detach, but they were the longest minutes of my life. I used my shirt to wrap my nub, but I knew I had to cauterize it soon. I gathered supplies to treat my giant opened hole where my arm used to be. I knew two things. I was going to survive, and I was going to get revenge. Now this little nub wasn't always so pretty. I had to collect a shit ton of material, old shirts, bandanas, and just any old materials I could find around the city. I made a makeshift bag gathering all my supplies, but my wound kept opening, and I was trailing massive amounts of blood. I passed out a couple of times, barely coming to in time to avoid getting torn apart. I had to run many times, but a huge horde of zombies was now on my trail. I had an idea to lead this continuously growing horde to that cabin with the moat that the young boy had led me to a month prior. Running out of the city towards the cabin, I looked back to see well over 50 of those bastards trailing me. Once I made it to the cabin, I jumped in the moat and submerged myself using the hose I had found as a snorkel. I waited under the water for a couple of minutes until I noticed the bridge to the moat being lowered. I waited a few more seconds until I heard what I believed to be gunfire. I peeked the top of my eyes out of the water to see John Williams using my shotgun to blast through the approaching horde that I had led straight to him. I lifted myself with my good arm up on the bridge and snuck inside the cabin. On the wall was a giant lever to lift the bridge. Having one arm made it extremely difficult, but not impossible. As I was closing the cabin from the outside, John turned to notice me. I wish I had my other hand so I could have flipped him the bird. I remembered how good that used to feel. Noticing me had distracted him enough to, well, once the first one grabbed him, he was a goner. I found my .45 pistol, moved a chair in front of the door, and sat to wait for the teenage boy. After about an hour or so, I don't know, time is irrelevant once you've been captive, I heard the boy scream, followed by more gunshots. After a little silence, the door lowered into a bridge, and I shot that little fuck right between the eyes.